He stood there on the sidewalk he had swept every morning for decades, a 73-year-old man holding nothing more threatening than a paper bag with his blood pressure medication inside. He wasn't armed. He wasn't threatening anyone. Then a cop pulled up, stepped out of his cruiser, and slapped him so hard his glasses shattered on the concrete. The whole town saw it on video. The police chief called it a misunderstanding. The mayor said, "Let the process work." But nobody, not one single person in that courtroom, knew that the old man's youngest son had just flown in from Quantico. Nobody knew what badge he was carrying in his jacket pocket until he walked through that door. Walter Langston had lived on Cypress Street in Delwood, Georgia for decades. He had moved there with his wife Dorothy when the town was still the kind of place where a black family settling on a quiet street caused curtains to move in neighboring windows and conversations to drop to whispers at the hardware store. Walter had survived all of it, the whispers, the anonymous notes left on his porch, the evening when someone spray-painted a single ugly word across his mailbox. He had survived because he was the kind of man who answered ugliness with consistency. He got up early every morning. He swept his porch and the sidewalk in front of his house. He grew tomatoes in the side yard. He volunteered at Calvary Baptist Church every Sunday, running the food pantry with Dorothy until she passed from breast cancer. And then he ran it alone. At 73, Walter Langston was not a large man. He stood 5'8" and had lost weight since Dorothy died, weight he couldn't seem to get back no matter how many casseroles the church ladies brought. He wore thick-framed glasses because his eyes had started failing him. He walked with a slight lean to the left because of an old back injury from his decades working at the county water treatment plant. He had retired with a modest pension, a plaque on the wall, and the respect of every man and woman who had worked under him. On one ordinary morning, Walter had one simple errand. He needed to pick up his blood pressure prescription from the pharmacy 4 blocks from his house. His doctor had called him personally the day before to remind him not to skip the refill. His pressure had been running high. He needed to stay on schedule. Walter put on his good brown coat, the one Dorothy had bought him years ago, tucked the pharmacy receipt into his pocket, and walked out into a cool Georgia morning. He never made it back home standing straight. Bryce Harlan had been with the Delwood Police Department for years. In those years, he had accumulated the kind of record that police departments in small Georgia towns used to tolerate and sometimes quietly celebrate. Multiple use-of-force complaints, formal grievances filed by citizens, most of them black, settlements paid out by the city's insurance fund for incidents involving traffic stops that escalated in ways the dash cam footage never quite captured cleanly. His sergeant had described Harlan in annual reviews as aggressive but effective, which in the culture of the Delwood PD meant he cleared calls fast and didn't ask too many questions about how. Harlan was 41 years old. He was the son of a former Delwood cop. He bowled on Thursday nights with other officers and city council members. He had a thin blue line tattoo on his left forearm and had once kept a Confederate flag phone case before a department memo made him switch it out for a plain black one while still displaying a small rebel flag sticker on his personal truck's rear window. On that morning, Harlan was on routine patrol when he pulled his cruiser onto Commerce Avenue. He would later claim he had received a dispatch call about a suspicious individual matching Walter Langston's description, an older black man loitering near the pharmacy. The dispatch log would later become a central piece of evidence in what followed, because the log showed no such call had been made. Not one. What it showed was that Harlan had self-initiated the stop. He pulled over. He got out. He walked up to Walter Langston, who was standing at the corner waiting for the crosswalk signal with a paper pharmacy bag in his hand. Hey, old man, what are you doing?" Walter turned. He had seen police officers approach him before. He knew in the way that every black man of his generation knew how to keep his hands visible and his voice calm and his eyes direct but not challenging. He had taught this to his sons the way his own father had taught it to him. an inheritance no man should have to pass down, but all of them did. "Just picked up my prescription," Walter said, "heading home." "You got ID?" "I do." Walter moved slowly, deliberately, to reach into his coat pocket. What happened next was captured on the phone camera of Destiny Cruz, a 24-year-old pharmacy technician who was on her lunch break across the street. Her phone was already up because she had seen Harlan approach, and something in her stomach had tightened. The footage is short. Walter Langston reaches into his coat pocket. He produces not a weapon, not a threat, but his state ID and the pharmacy receipt. The receipt with his name, his doctor's name, and the medication on it. He holds both out toward Officer Harlan. Harlan doesn't take them. Instead, he says something. The audio is partially obscured by street noise, but audio forensic analysts would later enhance it and testify to what they heard. "Don't get smart with me, boy." And then he slaps Walter Langston across the face, open hand, hard. The crack of it is audible on the recording. Walter stumbles backward. His glasses fly off his face and shatter when they hit the curb. He hits the wall of the building behind him and slides partially down it before catching himself. The pharmacy bag drops. The pill bottle rolls into the street. Destiny Cruz is heard on the video gasping and then screaming. 3 other people on the street stop walking. A car slows. Harlan looks around. He sees the phone. He sees the people. He gets back in his cruiser. He drives away without filing a report. By evening, Destiny Cruz's video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By midnight, it was at millions. By the following morning, when Walter Langston sat at his kitchen table with a bruise across his left cheek and his spare pair of glasses taped at the bridge, his name was being spoken on national news and every local affiliate between Atlanta and Savannah. The Delwood Police Department released a statement. Chief Wade Garrick, a veteran of the department who had hired Harlan and had signed off on each of Harlan's cleared complaints over the years, stood at a podium and said the following. "We are aware of a video circulating on social media depicting an interaction between one of our officers and a community member. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and have initiated an internal review. Officer Harlan has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that review. We ask the community to allow the process to work." He did not say Walter Langston's name. He did not call it an assault. He did not answer questions. Mayor Harlan Whitaker released a written statement from his office that was short and contained the phrase "ongoing investigation" twice. He did not call Walter Langston either. Walter's oldest son, Gregory Voss, a high school principal in Atlanta, drove to Delwood that same morning. He sat across the table from his father and held the old man's hands and listened as Walter described what had happened in the flat, measured tone of a man who had spent decades learning not to let his rage spill over because he knew what spilling over cost a black man in this country. "He called me boy," Walter said. Gregory stared at the table. "I'm 73 years old," Walter said. "I worked 40 years, and I paid my taxes, and I buried your mother, and I still can't walk 4 blocks to pick up my medicine." Gregory called an attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Franklin Ash out of Atlanta, who had handled multiple high-profile police misconduct cases. Ash drove down that afternoon, reviewed the video, reviewed Harlan's record, and told Walter Langston he had one of the strongest cases he had ever seen. But Ash had worked in Georgia long enough to know that strong cases and just outcomes were not the same thing. What nobody in the room mentioned, what Gregory had deliberately not mentioned yet, was their younger brother. Because their younger brother worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he was already on a plane. Raymond Voss was 44 years old and had been a special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division for years. He had not always been FBI. He had gone to college on an academic scholarship, graduated with a degree in criminal justice, done time with the State Bureau of Investigation, and then passed the FBI entrance exam on his first attempt. He had worked out of the Atlanta field office before being recruited to the Civil Rights Division in Washington, where his particular expertise, pattern analysis in law enforcement misconduct cases, specifically in jurisdictions with histories of systemic discrimination, had made him one of the more respected analysts in his unit. He was not a headline agent. He was not the kind of FBI agent you saw on the news giving press conferences. He was the kind of agent who spent months building a case so airtight that when it finally went to a grand jury, it did not fail. He had been part of teams that had brought federal charges against officers in multiple states. He understood how these cases worked. He understood how they were won and lost. He also understood something more personal. He had grown up watching his father navigate this country with patience and dignity and grace. And he had always known, in the way children of black men his father's generation always knew, that one day the country might show his father exactly what it thought of all that patience and dignity and grace. He had hoped he was wrong. When Gregory called him that morning, Raymond was already watching the video on his laptop in his apartment in Arlington, Virginia. He'd been watching it for minutes. He had watched it multiple times. "I'm coming," he said before Gregory had finished the first sentence. "Ray, you don't have to—" "I'm coming." He called his supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Donna Hargrave, before he booked his flight. He told her what had happened. He told her he was going to Georgia as a family member, not as an agent, but that he was flagging it because she needed to know. Hargrave was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Keep me informed." And Raymond, document everything. He understood what she meant. He landed in Atlanta, rented a car, and drove to Delwood. He did not announce himself. He did not go to the police department. He did not speak to any press. He went to his father's house, sat at the same kitchen table where Gregory was already sitting, and held his father the way a 44-year-old federal agent holds the man who taught him how to be a man, which is to say silently and for a long time. The preliminary hearing for the civil complaint filed by Franklin Ash on behalf of Walter Langston was scheduled in the Delwood Municipal Courthouse, a building that had last been renovated decades ago and still had the faint smell of old wood and old decisions in its walls. Bryce Harlan sat at the defense table with his attorney, a man named Stuart Kane, who specialized in representing law enforcement officers in Georgia and had a record of making cases like this one go away. Kane was expensive and he was good, and the Delwood Police Benevolent Association was paying his full rate. Harlan had, in the week since the incident, given one statement to the internal affairs investigator in which he claimed Walter had been moving erratically and that he had lost his footing during what Harlan described as a routine field interview. He did not explain how a man losing his footing produced a bruise in the exact shape and distribution of an open-hand strike across the left cheek. He did not address the audio enhancement of the word boy. Chief Wade Garrick sat in the gallery behind Harlan in his full dress uniform. Mayor Harlan Whitaker was not present, but two of his aides were. The courtroom was packed. Calvary Baptist Church had organized a quiet, dignified showing of support. Dozens of Walter's fellow congregants, most of them elderly, sitting in pressed Sunday clothes in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table. Local press was present. 2 Atlanta television cameras were set up in the back. Walter Langston sat next to Franklin Ash in a charcoal gray suit that Dorothy had picked out for him years ago. His spare glasses were still taped at the bridge. Gregory sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind him. Raymond sat 3 rows back. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and slacks. Nobody except his brother knew who he was or what he carried in the inside pocket of that jacket. The hearing began. Judge Margaret Hale, a woman who had been on the Delwood Municipal Bench for years, called the room to order. The first hour was procedural. Motions from Kane to limit the scope of the video evidence. Motions from Ash to introduce Harlan's prior complaint history. Judge Hale ruled on each with the careful neutrality of a judge who was aware of how many cameras were in her courtroom. Then Stuart Kane did something that nobody had anticipated. He called a witness. The witness was a man named Carl Reed, a white man who claimed to have been standing on Commerce Avenue the morning of the incident. Reed testified in a voice that was just confident enough to sound rehearsed without quite sounding scripted that he had seen Walter Langston acting aggressive toward Officer Harlan, that Walter had raised his voice and moved toward the officer in a threatening manner, and that what he had seen on the video didn't capture what had really happened because the angle was wrong. The gallery stirred. Franklin Ash let Reed finish. Then Ash stood up. "Mr. Reed, where exactly were you standing?" Reed gave an intersection. "And what time did you arrive at that intersection?" Reed gave a time. Ash picked up a document. "Mr. Reed, are you aware that the Commerce Avenue intersection has a city-maintained traffic camera on the southwest corner?" The courtroom went quiet. Kane was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Foundation." Ash was already handing the document to the clerk. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce footage from the Commerce Avenue municipal traffic camera, time-stamped the morning of the incident, obtained via public records request to the Delwood Department of Transportation." Judge Hale looked at the document. She looked at Kane. "Overruled. I'll allow it." The footage was played. Carl Reed was not on Commerce Avenue that morning. Not at the intersection he named. Not at any intersection on the block. The gallery erupted. Judge Hale banged her gavel. Kane's face had gone the color of old chalk. Ash turned to face Reed in the witness stand. "Mr. Reed, who asked you to testify today?" "Objection." I'll rephrase. "Mr. Reed, have you ever spoken with Officer Bryce Harlan or any member of the Delwood Police Department prior to today?" Reed's jaw moved. He said nothing. "Mr. Reed, I know some of the guys from the department socially." "Socially," Ash repeated. In the third row of the gallery, Raymond Voss was writing something in a small notebook. His expression had not changed. The hearing recessed for lunch. During the recess, Stuart Kane received a phone call in the courthouse parking lot that lasted minutes. Court security cameras recorded him pacing during the call and then standing very still for the last seconds of it. When court reconvened, Kane informed the judge that his client wished to make a statement. Harlan stood. He had prepared something. It was visible, a folded piece of paper he held in both hands. He read from it in a voice that was clearly aimed at the cameras in the back of the room. "I want to acknowledge that the interaction I had with Mr. Langston on that morning did not reflect the professional standards of the Delwood Police Department, and I regret any distress it caused to Mr. Langston and his family. I have the utmost respect for the community." "Excuse me." The voice came from the back of the courtroom. Every head turned. Raymond Voss was standing up. He was not looking at Harlan, he was looking at Judge Hale. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Raymond Voss. Walter Langston is my father." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced his credentials, the leather fold, the gold badge, the FBI identification card, and held them up so the judge could see them clearly. "I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division. I'm here today as a family member, not in an official capacity, but I want to inform the court that as of this morning, I submitted a formal referral to my division recommending a federal civil rights investigation into this incident and into the broader pattern of conduct complaints against Officer Harlan and the Delwood Police Department." The courtroom did not erupt this time. It went completely, utterly silent. Bryce Harlan's face, the face of a man who had slapped a 73-year-old across the face on a public street and driven away, who had been protected by his department and his union and a false witness for weeks, went the color of ash. Chief Wade Garrick, sitting in full-dress uniform in the gallery, put both hands flat on his knees. Kane stood up. "Your Honor, this is completely improper." Judge Hale held up one hand. She was looking at Raymond Voss with an expression that no one in the room could entirely read. Something between recognition and something that might have been, under her judicial composure, relief. "Agent Voss," she said carefully, "you're here as a private citizen today?" "Yes, Your Honor." But the referral you mentioned, that's a matter of federal record? Filed this morning, Your Honor. Case reference number available to any party who requests it through official channels. Kane sat down slowly, like a man who suddenly understood the floor might not hold him. Raymond sat down too. He looked at his father's back. The thin brown coat, the taped glasses, the straight-held spine of a man who had been getting up and sweeping a sidewalk for decades through everything this country had thrown at him. Walter Langston did not turn around, but he reached back with one hand and held it out, and Raymond took it. What followed in the next weeks was not television drama. It was the quieter, more thorough kind of dismantling. The kind that happens in federal records requests, in depositions, in the careful examination of phone records, and department logs and emails that people wrote assuming no one with real authority would ever read them. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a formal pattern or practice investigation into the Dellwood Police Department. The investigation was assigned to a team of agents and a supervising attorney named Margaret Cook, who had spent years in the Justice Department and had led similar investigations in other states. Cook's team began by pulling every use of force report filed in the Dellwood PD going back years. What they found was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention, but it was documented now in the precise and prosecutable language of federal review. Of the use of force incidents recorded over the years, the vast majority involved Black or Latino civilians. Of Harlan's complaints specifically, most had been filed by Black civilians. Of the formal grievances, the ones that had gone through the city's process, most had been downgraded to unfounded or officer-justified by the same internal affairs investigator, a sergeant named Arthur Voss, who had also happened to have been Bryce Harlan's training officer when Harlan joined the department. Arthur Voss retired abruptly, days after receiving a federal subpoena. Chief Wade Garrick did not retire. He was given the opportunity to in a closed meeting with the city attorney, Mayor Whitaker, and a representative from the FBI field office. He chose instead to fight it, which was his right. He retained an attorney and issued a public statement defending his department's record. It was the wrong decision because Cook's team, by this point, had the emails. The emails were from the departmental server obtained via federal subpoena, and they spanned years. They were not individually the kind of emails that made immediate headlines. They were instead the accumulation of a culture. Jokes that weren't jokes. Language that was consistent and directional. References to Black civilians in terms that were not fit to reproduce. Specific discussions between Garrick and Harlan and two other officers about how to document stops in ways that would be defensible. The emails also contained, buried in a thread from months earlier, a discussion about Walter Langston specifically. Walter Langston, who had attended city council meetings to speak during public comment about issues affecting elderly residents, had apparently attracted the attention of someone in the department. The thread referred to Walter as that old agitator on Cypress, and included a response from Harlan that said simply, "I know who he is, I got it." Months before the incident on Commerce Avenue, Bryce Harlan had been assigned to patrol the Commerce-Cypress corridor. It had not been random. When this information became public through a carefully managed leak to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that originated from a source no one ever officially identified, though Franklin Ash received an anonymous text message hours before the story ran that said, "Simply check your email. The Dellwood story changed entirely." It stopped being a story about one cop having a bad morning. It became something older and more deliberate and more damning. Derek Harlan was indicted by a federal grand jury on counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, the federal statute used to prosecute law enforcement officers who violate constitutional rights. The specific charge related to the assault on Walter Langston. A second count added by the grand jury on its own motion, after reviewing the email evidence, alleged a pattern of racially motivated selective enforcement. Stuart Kane, Harlan's attorney, held a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Atlanta and used phrases like prosecutorial overreach, and good officer and political climate. He looked like a man reading words he did not fully believe. Chief Wade Garrick resigned. The city issued a statement thanking him for his service. Mayor Harlan Whitaker announced he would not seek re-election. The city of Delwood, Georgia, reached a civil settlement with Walter Langston. The amount was not disclosed publicly, but Franklin Ash confirmed it was substantial and included, at Walter's specific request, 3 non-monetary provisions: a permanent civilian oversight board for the Delwood PD, mandatory body camera activation policies, and a public acknowledgement on city letterhead signed by the mayor that Walter Langston had done nothing wrong, that he had been targeted, and that the city was sorry. The letter took hours to negotiate. Walter Langston framed it and hung it in his kitchen next to a photograph of Dorothy. The law handled what the law could handle. But there were other things that happened in the margins of the official record that were, in their own way, as consequential. Carl Reed, the false witness, was charged with perjury in Georgia State Court. His attorney, a public defender, negotiated a plea to a lesser charge. Reed was sentenced to community service. He performed hours of it at the Calvary Baptist Church food pantry, where Walter Langston still volunteered every Sunday. On one Sunday, Reed arrived to find Walter Langston already at the distribution table stacking cans. They didn't speak for the first hours. Then, during a break, Reed sat on a folding chair near the door with a cup of coffee, and Walter walked past him, and Reed said quietly, "I'm sorry, Mr. Langston." Walter stopped. He looked at this man, clearly frightened, clearly ashamed, clearly not fully aware of what he had inserted himself into when he agreed to lie for Bryce Harlan in exchange for what the indictment later revealed was a promise of a reference for a city contract bid. Walter said, "I know you are." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair next to the man who had lied about him in a courtroom, and they sat there for minutes not saying much. Then they went back to work. This is not in any court record. Destiny Cruz, the pharmacy technician who filmed the original video, knew about it because she had started volunteering at the pantry herself, partly out of guilt for the weeks it had taken her to post the video publicly, partly because she'd met Walter at the civil hearing and found him to be the kind of person who makes you want to be better. Destiny was applying to nursing school. Arthur Voss, the retired internal affairs sergeant, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His cooperation was what gave Cook's team the specific knowledge that the use of force reviews had been deliberately manipulated. He gave a deposition that lasted hours across days. He cried during it, once when he described clearing a complaint against Harlan for an incident involving a teenager who had been pulled from his bicycle during a stop and had his wrist broken, and once when an investigator asked him if he had ever been afraid to tell the truth. The teenager's family was contacted by Ash's office. His case was reopened. The 2 other officers named in the email chain were placed on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the federal investigation. One resigned. The other was ultimately not charged federally, but was terminated by the city following the investigation's public report, which named him by name in connection with specific incidents. Bryce Harlan's trial was scheduled later. He rejected plea offers. His attorney Kane had begun to quietly distance himself from the case. His firm released a statement announcing that due to conflicts he would be withdrawing as counsel. Harlan was eventually represented by a public defender, a young woman who was only years out of law school, had never tried a federal civil rights case, and spent months before trial reading case law until her eyes ached. She did her best. Her best was not enough. On the 3rd day of trial, the prosecution played the enhanced audio of the word boy. On the 4th day, they played the email chain. On the 5th day, they introduced testimony from the teenager, now older, speaking in a voice that was controlled and clear and devastating about what it had felt like to have his bicycle knocked out from under him and his wrist grabbed and twisted while he asked what he had done wrong and received no answer. The jury, drawn from the greater Atlanta area, deliberated for hours. Bryce Harlan was convicted on both counts. He was sentenced to years in federal prison. He served every day of it. There are things that don't resolve the way justice is supposed to resolve them. The law has a shape to it: a beginning, a middle, an end, a filing date, a hearing, a verdict, a sentence. It moves in one direction, and it arrives somewhere you can point to on a calendar. Sentence served. Settlement reached. Chief resigned. Mayor not seeking re-election. You can write those things in a column, and they look like resolution. They look like the world correcting itself. But Walter Langston still woke up early every morning. He still made his coffee in the same percolator Dorothy had bought at a garage sale years ago, the one Gregory kept telling him to replace, and that he kept not replacing, because the coffee it made tasted exactly right. He still stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the side yard where his tomato plants were either coming in well or not, depending on the rain. He still put on his brown coat when the mornings were cool. He still walked to the pharmacy when he needed his prescription because it was blocks away and he was not going to stop walking blocks to do what he had always done. He had decided that on the morning after the incident, lying in bed with ice on his cheek, and he had not revisited the decision since. The bruise healed. These things always heal. It went from a deep reddish purple in the first days, the color of a thunderhead, to a flatter, older purple, then to the yellowed green of something fading, then to nothing. His skin took it and absorbed it the way skin absorbs most things, quietly and without asking for recognition. His new glasses were lighter than the old ones. Gregory had driven him to the optometrist and insisted on paying for the good frames, and Walter had let him, because Gregory needed to do something useful with his hands during that period, and buying his father good glasses was something useful. They fit well. The lenses were a slightly updated prescription, and the world came in a little sharper than it had been, edges more defined, text easier, the faces of people across a room less blurred. He supposed there was something to be said for that. But some nights, not every night, not even most nights, but some, he sat at the kitchen table after the late news and felt something settle over him that he couldn't name with the precision he would have preferred. Walter Langston was a man who believed in naming things correctly. He had run the water treatment plants division for years, and the first thing he had taught every new hire was, if you don't know what the problem is, name it exactly. Because a vague diagnosis produces a vague fix, and a vague fix produces the same problem on a longer timeline. So he sat with this feeling and tried to name it honestly. It wasn't bitterness. He had made a decision about bitterness decades ago. He had felt bitterness then, the real thing, sharp-edged and hot. He had sat with it for weeks, and then he had looked at it clearly and understood that it would cost more than it was worth. Not because the anger behind it was wrong, the anger was entirely right, but because bitterness turned the anger inward, and inward was the wrong direction. He had let it go. Not the anger, just the bitterness. He had kept the anger and put it somewhere useful. It wasn't grief either. Though grief was always present in a background way since Dorothy. Grief had a specific texture he knew well by now. The way it ambushed you in grocery stores, when you reflexively reached for the brand of crackers she liked. The way it lived in the particular afternoon light of a Sunday, when she would have been in the kitchen and the house would have been full of a certain kind of sound. He knew grief. This was adjacent to grief, but not the same thing. What it was, he finally decided, sitting at the table with a cup of chamomile tea, the verdict fresh, was the exhaustion of having been right about the danger for decades. There is no satisfaction in that kind of rightness. He had told his sons when they were young, told them the way his own father had told him, factually and without drama. The way you tell a child that a stove is hot, not to frighten them, but because they need to know that this country had a particular relationship with black men, and that relationship required navigation. He had taught them how to put their hands where they could be seen. He had taught them how to keep their voice level and their eyes direct but not challenging. He had taught them not because he wanted to teach it, but because the alternative, sending them into the world without it, was a thing he could not do. And he had hoped every year for decades that the lesson would become less necessary, that the world would shift enough that his grandsons, Gregory's boys, would not need to be taught the same thing. He was still hoping that, but hope and exhaustion can coexist in the same chest, and that night they did. He finished his tea and washed the cup and went to bed. He went back to the food pantry the Sunday after the verdict. He had been going every Sunday for years, and he saw no reason to stop. Some of the church members had suggested gently that he might want to take some time, that he had been through something, that it was all right to rest. Walter had listened to each of them with the full attention he gave everything, and then he had shown up early on Sunday morning to help unload the delivery van because the pantry opened soon and the cans didn't stack themselves. The Sunday he was back, Carl Reed arrived. Walter had known Reed would be coming. Franklin Ash had informed him of the community service arrangement before it was finalized, giving Walter the opportunity to object if he chose. Walter had not objected. He had thought about it for a day, and then told Ash that it was fine, that the man should do his hours somewhere useful. What he had not anticipated was what it would feel like to see him walk through the door. Reed was a medium-sized white man with the look of someone who had spent months not sleeping well, a specific kind of worn quality around the eyes that Walter recognized because he had seen it in mirrors. He came in quietly, spoke to the church volunteer coordinator, a woman named Harriet Odom, and was given an apron and a set of tasks, and went to work without making eye contact with anyone. Walter watched him from across the room for a while, not with malice, more the way you watch something you're trying to understand. They worked in the same building for hours without speaking. The pantry was busy that morning. It often was at the end of the month when money ran thin, and there was enough to do that silence between two people who didn't know each other was unremarkable. Walter worked his station. Reed worked his. During the break, Walter poured himself coffee and walked toward the door to get some air. And Reed was sitting there on a folding chair with his own cup and his eyes on the floor, and he said it without looking up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Langston." Walter stopped. He looked at this man. He thought about what it must take to say those words in this building to this person, and he thought about what Ash had told him, that Reed had agreed to lie in exchange for a city contract reference, which meant he had weighed one man's dignity against a business opportunity and chosen the business opportunity, which was a particular kind of cowardice that Walter understood as very human, even while finding it contemptible. He thought about what his father used to say, which was that every man who does a wrong thing is not a wrong man, and that the difference between the two is what they do with the weight of it afterward. He looked at Reed on the folding chair with his untouched coffee and his eyes on the floor. "I know you are," Walter said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down in the empty chair next to the man who had lied about him in a courtroom, and they sat there for minutes not saying much. Then they went back to work. Walter didn't tell Gregory or Raymond about it, not because he was hiding it, but because it felt like something that didn't need to be packaged into a story. It had happened. It was its own thing. It belonged to that Sunday morning and the folding chairs and the rectangles of light on the floor. Raymond came down from Washington the last weekend of July. He drove this time instead of flying. Said he'd wanted the hours in the car to think, which Walter understood. Raymond had always processed things best in motion, even as a child. He'd been the one who needed to pace while he talked, who came home from school and walked the yard before he'd say what kind of day it had been. Gregory drove down from Atlanta on the Saturday, and the three of them were together for the first time since the hearing. They ate ribs from a place on Main Road that did a dry rub Walter had liked for years. They sat on the back porch as the afternoon went along, and the Georgia heat turned from the flat white heat of midday into something softer, bronzed, the kind of heat that felt like the day deciding to let you go. They talked about the case, about Harlan's trial, about the federal investigation report that would be made public later, about the teenager and the fact that his family had finally been reached and his case reopened. They talked about Gregory's school, about a particular student Gregory was worried about, a teenager whose home situation sounded unstable. They talked about Raymond's next assignment, which he couldn't detail, but which would take him to a city in the Mid-South for several months. Then, the way it happens when family is comfortable with itself, they stopped talking about any of it and just sat. The yard moved in a slight evening breeze. Walter's tomatoes were coming in. A good year, better than last year, the rains having cooperated for once. Fireflies were beginning in the lower part of the yard near the fence. Small, hesitant lights trying themselves out against the dimming sky. Dad. Raymond was looking at the yard. I need to ask you something. Ask. Are you okay? Actually okay, not what you tell people. Walter let the question sit for a moment. He appreciated that Raymond had phrased it the way he had, the distinction between the performance of okay and the actual thing. Raymond had always been precise with language in the way that FBI agents became precise, which was also the way that honest people were precise. I'm okay, Walter said. I'm tired. Been tired for a while, but I'm okay. Raymond nodded. He didn't push, which was the right thing. I'll tell you what I think about, Walter said after a while. I think about Destiny. That girl who filmed it. She told me when I met her at the hearing that she'd been standing there for almost a minute before she held up the phone. Almost a minute, watching it happen. Being scared about what would happen if she filmed it and what would happen if she didn't. He shook his head slowly. She was 24 years old on her lunch break. She filmed it anyway. He looked at the fireflies. There's always somebody who films it, always somebody who tells the truth. The problem isn't that people don't see. It's that the people with the power to do something about what they see take their time about it. He paused. But Destiny didn't take her time. The teenager didn't take his time when he testified. You didn't take your time. He glanced at Raymond. You were already watching the video when Gregory called. Minutes before he called, Raymond said quietly. I know. Walter put his hand on his son's arm. I know, son. They sat with that. Your mother would have wanted every detail, Walter said. His voice changed on her. It always did, softened in a register that he couldn't control and had stopped trying to. She would have been in that courtroom in her good hat, the blue one with the brim. She would have sat right behind Franklin Ash, and she would have looked at Bryce Harlan the whole time and never flinched. Gregory made a sound, something between a laugh and something else. She would have brought food, he said. She would have brought a whole pan of something for the church members who came, and she would have organized a carpool. She would have called the mayor herself, Raymond said. She would have called the mayor, Walter agreed. And the mayor would have called her back, because everyone called Dorothy Langston back. Everyone in their right mind returned Dorothy Langston's calls. They were all laughing now. The way you laugh about someone gone fully without guilt because they were worth remembering in full color and full sound. The laughter went out into the yard over the tomatoes up past the early dark, where the fireflies were doing their patient blinking work. Walter looked at his garden. He thought about how many mornings he had come out here and put his hands in this dirt since she had been gone, and how the tomatoes had come anyway, and how that was either something comforting or something lonely depending on the day, and how most days lately it was both at once. He thought about the folding chair next to Carl Reed. He thought about the teenager crossing the street with his uncomfortable gratitude and his open hand. He thought about Destiny Cruz, who had started volunteering at the food pantry, and who had told Walter last week that she'd been accepted to the nursing program at Georgia State. He thought about the letter on the wall in the kitchen, city letterhead, mayor's signature. The words Walter Langston did nothing wrong in black ink that would last longer than the men who had to be compelled to write it. He thought about Dorothy's photograph next to it, He stood up slowly, the back taking its time, the way it did in the evenings now, and looked out at his yard in the July dark. "Come on," he said to his sons. "Let me show you how the tomatoes came in." The three of them walked down the porch steps into the warm night, into the yard that Walter Langston had kept for decades, on a street that had not always wanted him. And they walked among the plants in the dark, and the fireflies moved around them without agenda or meaning, blinking their small lights on and off, the way small lights do, persistent, patient, refusing to stop. Walter Langston went to pick up his blood pressure medication and came home with a bruise on his face and a broken pair of glasses. He was 73 years old, a retired public servant, a widower, a churchman, a man who swept his sidewalk every morning for decades. He was targeted deliberately, struck without cause, and then told by the systems designed to protect him to wait, to be patient, to let the process work. The process worked, but not the way they intended, because they didn't know about Raymond. They didn't know about Destiny and her phone. They didn't know about the teenager and his bicycle, or the emails they had written, assuming no one would ever read them, or the jury that would sit and listen to all of it and come back with a verdict that said, clearly, not this time. Walter's story is not just one man's story. It is the story of what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away. When a young woman holds up her phone. When a son walks into a courtroom with a badge. When an old man sits on a folding chair next to the man who lied about him and says, "I know you are." If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, please like this video and share it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that truth, slow as it is, has weight. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because they are everywhere, and they deserve to be told.